Nathaniel Brooks had spent years building a reputation. People in the city respected, but the cruelest part of success was realizing your own family could still look at you like you were never enough. 12 days before his younger sister Isabella's wedding, his phone vibrated while he was reviewing contracts in his office. He glanced at the screen expecting another vendor confirmation. But instead, he saw a message from his mother. "You shouldn't come to the wedding. The Kingsleys will think less of us if you're there." For 3 seconds, Nathaniel stared at the text in complete silence. Then another message appeared from his father. "Stop making this family look embarrassing." At that moment, something inside him turned cold. Not angry, not heartbroken, just clear. The kind of clarity that arrives when someone finally shows you exactly who they are. If you've ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you, subscribe now, because this story only gets more brutal from here. Nathaniel slowly leaned back in his chair, while the wedding binder remained open in front of him. 8 months of planning. 8 months of meetings, deposits, calls, schedules, floral arrangements, catering contracts, lighting installations, music bookings, transportation lists, and seating charts. Everything had been handled by him. Every single vendor contract carried his signature. Every payment came directly from his business account. His family had proudly accepted his help when they needed his money and connections. But now that Isabella was marrying into the wealthy Kingsley family, suddenly Nathaniel became the inconvenient relative they wanted hidden away. His assistant Madeline noticed the expression on his face immediately. She had worked beside him long enough to recognize danger before he even spoke. "Nathaniel, what happened?" she asked carefully. Without saying a word, he turned the phone toward her. She read the messages once, then read them again slower. The office became completely silent. Madeline slowly closed her laptop and whispered, "They actually said this to you?" Nathaniel gave a small smile that carried no warmth at all. Apparently, success still isn't enough when your family cares more about appearances than loyalty. He picked up the expensive silver pen Isabella had gifted him years earlier and opened the binder. "Start clearing my afternoon schedule," he said calmly. Madeline looked at him carefully. "What are you planning to do, Nathaniel?" Uncapped the pen with a soft click. "I'm removing my name from everything." The first call went to the luxury florist handling the wedding installation. "Cancel the entire order," Nathaniel said. The florist paused in shock. "Are you serious completely?" Within minutes, the cancellation was processed. The second call canceled the catering. The third shut down the transportation contract. Then the lighting company, the string quartet, the photographers. One by one, the perfect wedding his mother had bragged about for months began collapsing quietly behind the scenes. Nathaniel didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. The contracts belonged to him. The payments belonged to him. The entire illusion belonged to him. By late afternoon, more than half the wedding had disappeared. His phone exploded with calls from relatives, but he ignored every single one. Then Isabella finally texted him, "Please answer me. Mom says you're overreacting." Nathaniel stared at the message for several seconds before locking his phone again. Overreacting. That word almost made him laugh. People always called it overreacting when someone finally stopped tolerating disrespect. Hours later, his mother stormed into his office wearing pearls and a perfectly rehearsed smile. "Nathaniel, enough of this nonsense," she snapped. He remained seated behind the desk. "You told me not to attend the wedding. You misunderstood." "No," he replied calmly. "I understood perfectly." Her confident expression started cracking when he slid the cancellation confirmations across the table. The venue deposit was gone. The luxury catering was gone. The custom floral installations were gone. Her face lost all color. "You can't do this," she whispered. Nathaniel folded his hands together and looked directly into her eyes. "Actually, I can. Because every contract carried my name while all you contributed was criticism." For the first time in years, his mother had absolutely nothing to say, and deep down, Nathaniel realized something important in that moment. The people who constantly accuse others of being embarrassing are usually terrified someone will expose the truth about them instead. That night, while the city lights reflected against the office windows, Nathaniel picked up the silver pen again and quietly signed the final cancellation form. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't screaming, fighting, or destroying someone publicly. Sometimes revenge is simply removing your support and watching people collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. And trust me, this family was only beginning to fall apart. Isabella Monroe had dreamed about her wedding for years. But nothing could have prepared her for the moment she realized the most important person in her life had been quietly pushed out of it by their own family. 3 nights before the ceremony, she stood alone in the middle of a hotel ballroom that smelled faintly of fresh paint and cheap flowers, while workers rushed around setting up folding chairs under harsh fluorescent lights. This was not the elegant wedding she had imagined. This was not the luxury venue her mother had bragged about to relatives for months. The crystal chandeliers were gone. The imported orchids were gone. The string quartet was gone. Even the custom dance floor had disappeared. And deep down, Isabella already knew exactly why. Because the moment her family decided to humiliate Nathaniel, everything started collapsing. If you have ever watched people destroy their own happiness because of pride and appearances, leave a comment with your feelings below, because this story gets even more painful. Isabella still remembered the exact moment things changed. It happened 2 weeks earlier, during a dinner with the Kingsley family. Her mother, Catherine, had spent the entire evening pretending to be someone wealthier, more sophisticated, more important than she really was. Every sentence sounded rehearsed, every smile looked forced. Isabella had noticed it immediately, but Nathaniel had stayed calm through all of it. He had even handled several awkward conversations when Catherine forgot details about the wedding budget. Meanwhile, Alexander Kingsley's mother, Charlotte, had spent most of the evening talking to Nathaniel about his business. She asked thoughtful questions. She listened carefully. She treated him with respect. Isabella remembered catching her mother staring across the table, with a tight expression she could not understand at the time. Later she would realize it was jealousy. Not because Nathaniel embarrassed the family, but because he impressed people without even trying. Isabella sat down slowly at one of the unfinished reception tables and stared at the cheap centerpiece in front of her. White roses in a plastic vase. Her mother had tried calling it minimalist elegance, but everyone knew the truth. The original wedding had vanished after Nathaniel canceled the contracts, and honestly, Isabella could not blame him anymore. At first she had believed her mother's version of events. Catherine told her Nathaniel was acting emotional and dramatic. She claimed he wanted attention. She insisted he was trying to ruin the wedding out of jealousy. But then Isabella saw the text messages herself. She saw the words her parents had sent him. "You make this family look embarrassing." The sentence replayed in her mind over and over like a nightmare she could not escape. Nathaniel had spent months helping her. He paid deposits. He negotiated discounts. He managed vendors. He answered late-night phone calls while still running his own company. He never complained once. And this was how their parents repaid him. Isabella pressed both hands against her face and fought back tears. "You okay?" Alexander asked softly as he walked toward her. He loosened his tie and sat beside her at the table. She looked at him for several seconds before finally speaking. "I think my family destroyed itself." Alexander stayed quiet, letting her continue. "Nathaniel did everything for this wedding," she whispered, "and my parents treated him like he was something shameful." Alexander sighed quietly. "Charlotte told me there was more happening behind the scenes than your mother admitted." Isabella laughed bitterly. "That sounds polite compared to the truth." For a moment neither of them spoke. Workers continued dragging equipment across the ballroom floor, while distant music echoed from another event down the hallway. Isabella suddenly remembered being younger and following Nathaniel everywhere as children. He used to protect her whenever their parents argued. He taught her how to ride a bike. He stayed awake helping with school projects late into the night. Even after building his business, he always answered her calls, always showed up when she needed help. And now she realized something horrifying. She had spent so much time trying to keep peace inside the family that she failed to protect the one person who had always protected her. "I should have defended him," she whispered. Alexander looked at her carefully. "Then do it now." That sentence hit harder than she expected, because he was right. Maybe it was too late to save the wedding from disaster, but it was not too late to tell the truth. Isabella stood up slowly and looked across the ballroom, toward her mother, who was aggressively directing workers while pretending nothing was wrong. For the first time in her life, Isabella did not feel intimidated by her. She felt disappointed, deeply disappointed. She pulled out her phone and opened Nathaniel's last message. "I love you, but you need to decide whose side you're on." At the time, she thought the message felt unfair. Now, she understood it perfectly. Silence was also a choice. Looking away was also betrayal. Isabella typed 3 words into the reply box. "I'm sorry, Nathaniel." She stared at the message for several seconds before pressing send. And honestly, that apology felt heavier than the wedding dress hanging in her hotel suite upstairs. Because some heartbreaks are not caused by enemies. Sometimes they are caused by realizing the people you trusted allowed someone you love to suffer quietly for years. If this story hit you emotionally, comment below with what you would have done in Isabella's situation. Catherine Monroe had spent most of her life chasing a version of status she thought would finally make people admire her, but the terrifying truth about obsession is that eventually you start sacrificing the people closest to you just to protect an image that was never real in the first place. The morning after Nathaniel canceled half the wedding, Catherine stood alone inside her kitchen, gripping a cup of coffee so tightly her fingers hurt, while her phone buzzed nonstop with messages from relatives asking why the venue had suddenly changed. She ignored every single one, because the real panic sitting in her chest had nothing to do with flowers, catering, or ballroom reservations. She was terrified Charlotte Kingsley had started seeing the truth. And if there's one thing dangerous people can't survive, it's being exposed by someone they desperately wanted to impress. If you've ever watched someone destroy their own family, trying to look important to strangers, hit subscribe now, because this story keeps getting uglier. Catherine walked toward the dining room mirror and stared at herself carefully. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, pearl earrings, designer blouse. Everything looked polished from the outside, but inside she felt something cracking apart. For years she had carefully controlled the image of her family. Richard handled finances. Isabella was beautiful and sweet. And Nathaniel was complicated. Successful, yes, but too independent. Too confident. Too impossible to control. Catherine hated how people naturally respected him the moment he entered a room, especially wealthy people, especially Charlotte Kingsley. That dinner with the Kingsleys weeks earlier had changed everything. Catherine still remembered the humiliation burning inside her, while Charlotte ignored most of her rehearsed stories, and instead spent the entire evening talking to Nathaniel about his business achievements. Charlotte listened to him seriously. She laughed at his jokes naturally. She asked for his opinion like it actually mattered. Meanwhile, Catherine sat there smiling through clenched teeth, realizing the woman she desperately wanted approval from seemed more impressed by her son than by her. And jealousy like that doesn't stay quiet for long. At first, Catherine convinced herself she only needed a little distance between Nathaniel and the wedding, just enough to keep attention focused on Isabella and the Kingsleys. But slowly the conversations became crueler. She started complaining about Nathaniel constantly to Richard and her sister Vivian Harper. "He makes everything about himself," she would say bitterly. "Charlotte keeps asking about his company instead of the wedding." Richard rarely argued with her anymore. It was easier to stay silent, easier to let Catherine build her own version of reality without interruption. Eventually silence became agreement, and agreement became betrayal. Catherine sat down at the kitchen table, remembering the exact moment she sent the message, telling Nathaniel not to attend the wedding. At the time she told herself it was necessary, temporary, strategic. She convinced herself wealthy families valued perfection above loyalty. But deep inside she already knew the truth. She wasn't protecting Isabella's future. She was protecting her own insecurity. The worst part was realizing Nathaniel had never actually tried to embarrass her. He simply existed confidently without needing her approval, and somehow that threatened her more than failure ever could. Her phone suddenly rang again. "Charlotte Kingsley?" Catherine froze instantly before answering with a practiced cheerful voice. "Charlotte, good morning." Charlotte's tone remained calm, but cold underneath. "Catherine, I reviewed some of the wedding invoices this morning." Catherine's stomach tightened painfully. "Oh, interesting how almost every major payment came directly from Nathaniel's company account." Catherine forced a nervous laugh. "Nathaniel enjoys helping. He can be dramatic sometimes, but he means well." Silence. Then Charlotte spoke again carefully. "Do you know what I find interesting about truly successful people, Catherine?" Catherine's throat tightened. "What's that?" "They rarely need to convince others they matter." The sentence hit like a slap. Catherine felt heat rise into her face instantly. For several seconds she could not respond. Charlotte continued calmly. Nathaniel built something impressive. You should probably stop treating that like a threat. After the call ended, Catherine remained frozen at the kitchen table, staring blankly ahead. Because for the first time someone had spoken the truth directly to her face, she had spent years competing with her own son instead of loving him, years measuring worth through appearances, invitations, expensive venues, and approval from strangers. And now the entire illusion was collapsing publicly. Richard entered the kitchen quietly a few minutes later. People are talking, he muttered. Catherine laughed bitterly. Of course they are. He hesitated before speaking again. Maybe we pushed Nathaniel too far. Catherine looked at her husband with disbelief. You agreed with me. Richard avoided eye contact immediately. I know. That answer somehow hurt even worse. Because it reminded Catherine that cowardice inside families spreads quietly. One person creates the cruelty, another person allows it, and eventually everyone pretends the damage happened naturally. Catherine stood up slowly and looked out the kitchen window toward the empty backyard. She remembered Nathaniel as a child, sitting outside drawing business logos on notebook paper, while telling everyone he would own a company someday. Back then she used to laugh at him affectionately. Somewhere along the way, affection turned into resentment, pride turned into competition, and now the son she spent years pushing aside had become the only person strong enough to walk away completely. Catherine closed her eyes for a long moment and whispered something she would never say publicly. I didn't think he'd leave us. But sometimes people don't leave because they stop loving their family. Sometimes they leave because they finally realize love should not require humiliation. And Catherine Monroe was only beginning to understand how expensive that lesson would become. If this story shocked you, subscribe and stay with me, because the wedding disaster hasn't even reached its worst moment yet. Edward Monroe always believed silence made him a good father. But the terrifying thing about silent people is that they often don't realize they are helping destroy lives until there is nothing left to save. The night before Isabella's wedding, Edward sat alone in his dark living room, staring at a half-empty glass of whiskey while the television played quietly in the background. He wasn't really watching it. His mind kept replaying the moment Nathaniel walked past him in the hotel hallway earlier that afternoon without saying a single word. No anger, no shouting, no begging for approval, just disappointment. And somehow that hurt Edward far more than rage ever could. Because deep down he knew something painful. Nathaniel had finally stopped expecting his father to defend him. If you've ever seen someone realize too late that silence can ruin a family just as badly as cruelty, subscribe and stay with me, because this chapter changes everything. Edward leaned back slowly against the couch and closed his eyes. He remembered when Nathaniel was younger and used to follow him everywhere around the house, asking questions about business, money, success, responsibility. Nathaniel admired him once. That memory now felt almost unbearable. Back then, Edward would promise himself he was teaching his son strength by being emotionally distant. He believed discipline mattered more than affection. Achievement mattered more than reassurance. And over the years he convinced himself Nathaniel understood that. But maybe Nathaniel never understood it. Maybe he simply learned to survive without needing anything from his father at all. The sound of heels clicking across the hardwood floor pulled Edward out of his thoughts. Catherine entered the room, still wearing her pearl earrings and expensive silk robe, but the confidence she normally carried had disappeared completely. People are talking, she whispered nervously. Edward took a slow sip of whiskey. Of course they are. Catherine crossed her arms tightly. Charlotte Kingsley humiliated me tonight. Edward didn't respond immediately. That silence irritated her instantly. Are you even listening to me? She snapped. He finally looked up at her. I think Charlotte told you the truth. Catherine froze. Excuse me. Edward exhaled heavily and rubbed his forehead. Nathaniel paid for almost everything. He worked for months to help this family, and we treated him like he was some embarrassment we needed to hide. Catherine's expression hardened immediately. Don't start blaming me for this. Edward laughed quietly, but there was no humor in it. That's the problem, Catherine. I should have blamed you earlier. The room became completely silent. For years, Edward avoided conflict by agreeing with whatever kept the peace temporarily. When Catherine complained about Nathaniel being too independent, Edward stayed quiet. When she mocked his business ideas years ago, Edward stayed quiet. Even when she suggested uninviting him from the wedding, Edward still said nothing. At the time, silence felt easier than confrontation. Now he understood silence had consequences too. Catherine stared at him in disbelief. "You supported every decision." Edward nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I'm ashamed of." Those words landed harder than either of them expected. Catherine looked away first. Edward stood up and walked toward the large dining room window overlooking the empty backyard. The house suddenly felt unfamiliar to him. Too quiet, too cold. He remembered Nathaniel spending late nights at the dining table, working on business plans, while everyone else slept. Edward used to secretly admire how determined his son was, but instead of saying that out loud, he criticized him constantly. He called him unrealistic, obsessive, difficult. Maybe because part of him envied Nathaniel's confidence. Nathaniel had built a successful company from nothing, while Edward spent most of his own life trying not to fail instead of truly succeeding. "Do you know what the worst part is?" Edward asked quietly, without turning around. Catherine said nothing. "He still helped us anyway." Catherine's face tightened painfully. "I never thought he'd actually walk away." Edward closed his eyes briefly. "That's because we got used to him staying no matter how badly we treated him." The truth sat heavily between them. Nathaniel had always been the dependable one, the problem solver, the person who showed up no matter how unfairly he was treated. Families like theirs become dangerously comfortable, relying on strong people while giving them almost nothing emotionally in return. And eventually, strong people stop coming back. Catherine sat down slowly on the couch, suddenly looking exhausted instead of elegant. "What do we do now?" she whispered. Edward stared out the window at the darkness for several long seconds before answering. "I honestly don't know." That terrified him more than anything. For the first time in years, he could not calculate a solution. He could not smooth things over with money excuses or silence. Nathaniel was gone emotionally long before he canceled the wedding contracts. Edward simply failed to notice it until now. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket. A message from Isabella. "Dad, Nathaniel left the reception early. Mom pushed him too far." Edward read the message twice before locking the screen again. Then something unexpected happened. He felt ashamed, solely, because real weakness wasn't Nathaniel showing emotion. Real weakness was watching someone you love get mistreated for years and doing absolutely nothing to stop it. Edward finished the last sip of whiskey and placed the empty glass carefully onto the table. "I think I lost my son," he said quietly. Catherine looked at him with tears finally forming in her eyes, but neither of them argued anymore, because some truths arrived too late to fix. And the saddest part of all was that Nathaniel probably stopped hoping for a different father years ago. If this story hit harder than you expected, subscribe, because the wedding fallout is only beginning to tear this family apart completely. Charlotte Kingsley had spent her entire adult life sitting across negotiation tables with billionaires, politicians, and ruthless executives, but nothing disturbed her more than watching a family slowly destroy the one person holding them together while pretending everything was perfectly fine. On the morning of Isabella Monroe's wedding, Charlotte stood near the massive hotel window overlooking the city traffic below, while distant music echoed through the ballroom floors beneath her suite. Staff members hurried past carrying bouquets, steaming dresses, and organizing seating charts, yet Charlotte barely noticed any of it. Her attention remained fixed on one alarming detail. Nathaniel Brooks had completely disappeared from the wedding. No calls, no appearances, no quiet problem-solving behind the scenes. And unlike the Monroe family, Charlotte immediately understood what that silence truly meant. Because people like Nathaniel do not vanish emotionally unless they have already been pushed too far. If you've ever watched the strongest person in a family get treated like the problem simply because they refuse to stay weak, subscribe now, because this chapter exposes the truth nobody wanted spoken out loud. Charlotte slowly adjusted the bracelet on her wrist, while replaying every interaction she had ever shared with Nathaniel over the past several months. Catherine Monroe constantly described him as difficult, cold, and too intense. But Charlotte trusted observation far more than emotional accusations. Nathaniel always arrived early. He remembered names. He respected staff members. He handled pressure without creating chaos. Most importantly, he never once tried to impress wealthy people by pretending to be someone else. Charlotte admired that immediately because she had spent decades around insecure people hiding behind expensive clothing and fake confidence. Nathaniel possessed something much rarer: quiet self-respect. That was why Catherine feared him so much, even if she never admitted it openly. 2 weeks earlier, Charlotte accidentally uncovered a truth the Monroe family clearly hoped nobody would notice. During a private conversation with the hotel coordinator, Charlotte reviewed several vendor contracts after hearing rumors about delayed payments. What she found shocked her. Nearly every major wedding expense had been financed through Nathaniel's company account. The ballroom deposit, the luxury floral arrangements, the live musicians, the imported champagne, even the transportation services for out-of-town guests. Nathaniel had quietly carried the financial weight of the entire wedding, while receiving almost no appreciation in return. Yet Catherine still spoke about him like an embarrassment, instead of the reason the wedding existed at all. Charlotte remembered sitting silently inside the conference room, while anger slowly built inside her chest. Families often become addicted to sacrificing their strongest member, because dependable people make cruelty look survivable. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Alexander entered the suite, adjusting his jacket nervously. Mom, guests are already taking their seats downstairs. Charlotte nodded slowly before asking the question she already feared hearing the answer to. Have you heard from Nathaniel today? Alexander hesitated for a second too long. No. Charlotte looked away toward the crowded streets below the hotel windows. That's not good, she murmured quietly. Alexander frowned. Do you really think things are that serious? Charlotte turned toward him calmly. Alexander, when emotionally exhausted people finally stop showing up, the damage usually started years earlier. Her son remained silent. Charlotte could tell he was beginning to understand the situation differently now. Downstairs inside the ballroom, tension leaked through every corner despite the expensive decorations and forced smiles. Guests whispered openly about the sudden changes to the wedding setup. The replacement flowers looked rushed. The lighting felt cheaper. Several cancelled services had clearly been replaced at the last minute. Catherine Monroe moved frantically between tables, trying to maintain control while pretending nothing had gone wrong. Charlotte watched her carefully from the balcony above and realized something deeply sad. Catherine cared more about protecting appearances than protecting relationships. That kind of obsession eventually destroys everything it touches. Then Charlotte noticed Isabella standing alone near the reception stage, with tears filling her eyes while staring down at her phone screen. Charlotte immediately walked downstairs toward her. Isabella, she asked softly, where is your brother? Isabella swallowed hard before whispering, he left early this morning. Charlotte's expression darkened slightly. Did anyone try stopping him? Isabella looked down, without answering. That silence said more than words ever could. Charlotte gently touched her arm. Nathaniel loves this family more than any of you realize. Isabella's voice trembled instantly. I know. Charlotte nodded sadly. Then understand something important before it's too late. Strong people don't leave because they stop caring. They leave because nobody cared when they were hurting. Isabella covered her mouth as tears slipped down her face. Across the ballroom, Catherine noticed the conversation and quickly approached them wearing a nervous smile. Charlotte, the ceremony starts in a few minutes. Charlotte turned toward her slowly. Before this wedding begins, I think you owe your son the truth. Catherine froze immediately. What do you mean? Nearby guests suddenly became very quiet. Charlotte lowered her voice but kept every word sharp and controlled. Nathaniel financed this wedding, solved its problems, protected your reputation, and endured humiliation from his own family, while asking for almost nothing in return. Catherine forced an uncomfortable laugh. You're misunderstanding the situation. Charlotte stepped closer calmly. No, Catherine, I understand it perfectly. The real problem is that your son became successful without needing your approval, and instead of being proud of him, you treated him like competition. The silence afterward felt unbearable. Isabella quietly cried beside them while several relatives avoided eye contact completely. Catherine stood frozen beneath the weight of a truth she could no longer escape publicly. Charlotte studied her for several long seconds before speaking one final time. Nathaniel earned my respect because he handled disrespect with dignity, she said quietly. Very few people are strong enough to do that. Then Charlotte turned and walked toward the ballroom entrance, as the wedding music slowly began playing in the background, because deep down, she already understood something the Monroe family still refused to admit. Nathaniel Brooks was never the embarrassment in that family. He was the only reason it had not completely fallen apart much sooner. If this chapter hit harder than expected, subscribe and stay until the next part, because the emotional fallout from this wedding is only beginning. Nathaniel Brooks sat alone inside the penthouse office overlooking the city lights, while rain struck the glass windows hard enough to sound like distant applause. But for the first time in years, success no longer felt satisfying. His phone had been vibrating nonstop for hours with messages from relatives, vendors, and even strangers connected to Isabella's wedding disaster. Yet he ignored every single notification, because none of them were asking how he felt. They only wanted to know how badly the Monroe family was collapsing without him there, to quietly fix everything again. And deep down, Nathaniel finally understood something painful. People often mistake dependable individuals for emotionless ones, simply because they hide their exhaustion well. The truth was, he had been tired for years. Tired of proving his worth. Tired of carrying people who only noticed him when they needed help. Tired of being treated like an emergency solution instead of family. The city skyline reflected faintly across the dark office windows, as Nathaniel loosened his tie and stared down at the wedding invitation sitting unopened on his desk. Elegant gold lettering. Expensive paper. Perfect presentation. It almost made him laugh, because nothing about that family had felt genuine for a very long time. Earlier that evening, Isabella had finally sent him a message. "I'm sorry, Nathaniel." Only 3 words. Yet somehow those 3 words hurt more than all the insults Catherine ever threw at him. Because Isabella had finally seen the truth. Too late maybe, but she saw it now. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Memories surfaced immediately. Him staying awake late at night helping Isabella finish school projects while their parents argued downstairs. Him secretly paying overdue bills years earlier. After Edward made disastrous financial decisions nobody else knew about. Him spending months organizing the wedding because he genuinely wanted Isabella to feel loved on the happiest day of her life. And through all of it, he never once expected gratitude. Respect would have been enough. But even that eventually became impossible. The soft buzz of the office elevator interrupted his thoughts. A moment later, Adrian Keller stepped into the penthouse carrying 2 cups of coffee. Adrian had known Nathaniel longer than almost anyone. Business partner, best friend. One of the few people capable of reading Nathaniel's silence correctly. "You look terrible," Adrian said calmly while setting down the coffee. Nathaniel smirked faintly. "That's encouraging." Adrian sat across from him and studied his face carefully. "You finally stopped rescuing them, didn't you?" Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. Outside, the rain continued hitting the windows in steady waves. "Do you know what the worst part is?" he asked quietly. Adrian remained silent. "I kept hoping if I helped enough, eventually they'd treat me like I mattered." Adrian sighed softly and leaned back in his chair. Families get comfortable depending on strong people. After a while, they stop seeing the person and only notice the usefulness. Nathaniel stared down at his untouched coffee. "I think my mother hated that I succeeded without needing her approval." Adrian nodded slowly. Some parents love control more than connection. The office fell silent again. Nathaniel looked exhausted in a way success could never fix. Because emotional exhaustion doesn't come from hard work alone. It comes from loving people who slowly convince you your value only exists when you are sacrificing yourself for them. Nathaniel picked up the wedding invitation and turned it over in his hands thoughtfully. "You know what's strange," he muttered quietly. "I still wanted today to be perfect for Isabella." Adrian watched him carefully. "That's because you actually loved your family." Nathaniel laughed bitterly. "Funny how that works." His phone suddenly lit up again across the desk. Catherine Monroe calling. Nathaniel stared at the screen for several seconds, before flipping the phone face down without answering. Adrian raised an eyebrow slightly. No speech. No final confrontation. Nathaniel shook his head slowly. "I spent years explaining my feelings to people who only listened when it benefited them." The rain outside intensified, washing blurred reflections across the city skyline. Nathaniel stood up and walked toward the massive windows, overlooking downtown traffic below. Somewhere across the city, Isabella's wedding reception was probably falling apart in real time. Vendors complaining, relatives gossiping, Catherine desperately trying to protect appearances. Yet strangely, Nathaniel no longer felt angry, just empty. "You know what I realized tonight?" he asked quietly, without turning around. Adrian stood slowly behind him. What Nathaniel looked out at the storm-covered city. Being needed is not the same thing as being loved. Those words settled heavily into the room. Adrian didn't try correcting him because he knew the statement came from years of accumulated disappointment, not temporary emotion. Nathaniel finally understood the difference between loyalty and emotional survival. Loyalty had kept him trapped inside painful relationships far longer than he should have stayed. Survival was finally teaching him how to walk away. His phone vibrated once more. Another message from Isabella. "I wish I defended you sooner." Nathaniel stared at the words silently before locking the screen again. The truth was, he didn't need apologies anymore. What he needed was distance. Peace. A life where love didn't constantly require humiliation as proof of loyalty. Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly, while thunder echoed outside the penthouse windows. Somewhere deep inside, something painful was finally ending. Not his love for his family, but the version of himself willing to destroy his own emotional health, just to keep everyone else comfortable. And honestly, that loss felt strangely freeing. The wedding reception was supposed to feel magical, but by the time the first dance ended, the entire ballroom already felt like a beautiful lie, slowly collapsing under the weight of secrets nobody could hide anymore. Crystal lights reflected across polished marble floors, while soft violin music echoed through the luxury venue. Yet beneath the expensive decorations and forced smiles, tension moved through the Monroe family like a storm waiting to explode. Guests whispered behind champagne glasses. Relatives exchanged uncomfortable looks. Even the hotel staff sensed something was wrong, because the one person who had quietly held everything together was gone, and suddenly everyone realized how fragile the family actually was without him. Nathaniel Brooks had disappeared, and his absence was louder than any argument could ever be. If you've ever watched a family realize too late who truly carried them emotionally, leave a comment below, because this chapter hurts more than anyone expected. Isabella Monroe stood near the edge of the dance floor, pretending to smile for photographers, while her hands shook slightly beneath the fabric of her wedding dress. Every few seconds she checked her phone again, even though no new messages appeared. Deep down, she already knew Nathaniel wasn't coming back tonight. That realization sat heavily in her chest, because for the first time in her life, she understood how often her brother sacrificed his own happiness just to keep peace inside the family. Across the ballroom, Catherine Monroe continued greeting guests with artificial confidence while quietly unraveling inside. Charlotte Kingsley's confrontation earlier had shaken her badly. For years, Catherine controlled every narrative inside the family by speaking loudly enough that nobody questioned her version of events. But Charlotte had done something dangerous. She forced the truth into public view. And once people see the truth clearly, pretending becomes impossible. Edward Monroe sat silently near the bar, staring into a glass he barely touched. He looked exhausted, older somehow. Several relatives approached him throughout the evening, asking awkward questions about Nathaniel's sudden disappearance, but Edward avoided every conversation, because there was no explanation left that could make the family look innocent anymore. Nearby, whispers continued spreading through the ballroom. Nathaniel paid for most of this wedding. Did you hear Catherine uninvited him? Apparently he canceled the original venue contracts himself. The rumors multiplied faster every minute. Isabella overheard fragments of those conversations while trying not to cry in front of guests. Each whisper felt like another crack forming inside the carefully built illusion her parents spent years protecting. Then something unexpected happened. One of the hotel managers approached Catherine, near the reception table holding several documents. His expression looked nervous. "Mrs. Monroe," he said quietly, "there's an issue regarding the remaining balance." Catherine forced a smile instantly. "Now isn't really the time." The manager hesitated before lowering his voice further. The temporary payment extensions were approved personally by Mr. Brooks. Without his authorization, the final invoices need immediate confirmation tonight. Catherine's face drained of color almost instantly. Several nearby guests noticed the tension immediately. Charlotte Kingsley watched the interaction carefully from across the room without saying a word. Catherine grabbed the documents quickly and pulled the manager aside, but the damage was already done. People had heard enough. Isabella closed her eyes briefly in humiliation. Nathaniel had protected the family financially, even while being treated like an embarrassment. And now the entire ballroom was beginning to realize it publicly. Alexander Kingsley walked toward Isabella carefully. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Isabella laughed bitterly through tears. "Honestly, no." Alexander glanced across the room toward Catherine, arguing quietly with hotel staff. "I think people are starting to understand what Nathaniel really did for this family." Isabella looked down at her hands, "And we never defended him." Alexander remained silent, because there was nothing left to deny anymore. Across the ballroom, Catherine suddenly raised her voice at one of the coordinators. "This is completely inappropriate tonight." The sharp tone caused nearby conversations to stop immediately, but the coordinator stayed calm. "Mrs. Monroe, we simply need authorization." Catherine looked trapped now, cornered. For years appearances protected her from consequences, but appearances were no longer strong enough to hold the situation together. Edward finally stood up from the bar and walked slowly toward her. "Stop," he said quietly. Catherine turned toward him in disbelief. "Excuse me." Edward looked exhausted as he glanced at the unpaid invoices in her hands. "Nathaniel handled everything for us. Maybe it's time we stop pretending otherwise." The silence afterward felt suffocating. Several relatives lowered their eyes immediately while others stared openly. Catherine's lips trembled slightly. "You're embarrassing me in front of everyone." Edward's expression hardened sadly. "No, Catherine. We embarrassed ourselves the moment we treated our son like he didn't matter." Isabella covered her mouth as tears rolled down her face. Charlotte Kingsley watched quietly nearby, understanding this moment had nothing to do with money anymore. This was about truth finally breaking through years of emotional manipulation and denial. Catherine looked around the ballroom, desperately searching for support, but nobody spoke. Because deep down everyone already knew Edward was right. Nathaniel carried the family emotionally, financially, and practically, for years, while receiving criticism instead of appreciation. And now that he was gone, the emptiness he left behind had become impossible to ignore. The violin music continued softly in the background, while guests stood frozen inside the uncomfortable silence. A wedding designed to celebrate love had somehow become a public exposure of everything broken inside the Monroe family. Isabella slowly wiped tears from her face and whispered the painful truth nobody could avoid anymore. "We should have loved him better." And honestly, nobody in that ballroom had the courage to disagree. If this chapter hit you emotionally, leave a comment sharing whose side you would stand on in this situation. Nathaniel Brooks always believed emotional pain became easier once you learned how to hide it properly, but the terrifying truth about hidden pain is that eventually it stops looking like sadness and starts looking like emotional distance that nobody notices until it's too late. 3 days after Isabella's disastrous wedding reception, Nathaniel sat alone inside a quiet restaurant overlooking the river, while untouched coffee slowly cooled beside him. The city moved normally outside the windows. People laughed. Cars passed. Couples held hands beneath the evening lights. Yet inside Nathaniel's chest, everything still felt strangely numb. Not dramatic, not explosive. Just empty, in a way exhaustion often feels, after someone spends years carrying emotions too heavy for one person to manage alone. Across social media and family group chats, rumors about the Monroe family continued spreading rapidly. Some blamed Catherine. Others blamed Edward for staying silent too long. A few relatives even tried blaming Nathaniel himself for abandoning the wedding. That part almost made him laugh. People become incredibly uncomfortable when dependable individuals finally stop sacrificing themselves. Suddenly boundaries get labeled selfishness, because nobody benefits from them anymore. If you've ever watched someone finally walk away after years of emotional exhaustion, leave a comment below because this chapter reveals what breaking points actually look like in real life. Nathaniel stared down at his untouched coffee, while memories surfaced one after another without permission. Him canceling business trips to solve family emergencies, nobody thanked him for afterward. Him paying bills quietly to protect his parents from embarrassment. Him listening to Catherine criticize everything from his personality to his career choices, while Edward remained silent nearby, pretending peace mattered more than fairness. The worst part was not the criticism itself. It was realizing how normal the disrespect eventually became. People can survive almost anything temporarily. But repeated emotional neglect changes the way a person sees themselves over time. Nathaniel once believed if he worked harder, stayed calmer, and sacrificed more, eventually his family would treat him differently. Instead, they simply expected more from him every year. The chair across from him suddenly moved slightly. Nathaniel looked up to see Isabella standing there, holding her purse tightly with nervous hands. Her eyes looked tired from crying. "Can I sit down?" she asked quietly. Nathaniel studied her face for several seconds before nodding slowly. Isabella sat carefully across from him while silence settled between them almost immediately. The restaurant lights reflected softly across the river outside, while distant conversations echoed quietly around them. "I didn't know if you'd come," Nathaniel admitted finally. Isabella looked down at the table. "I almost didn't." Nathaniel frowned slightly. Why? She swallowed hard before answering. "Because I was ashamed." Those words hit harder than she probably realized. Nathaniel leaned back quietly in his chair. Isabella rubbed her hands together nervously before continuing. "I spent years watching Mom treat you badly. And I kept telling myself it wasn't serious enough to confront." Nathaniel didn't interrupt her. "And every time you fixed another problem for us," she whispered, "I think we all became more comfortable ignoring how much pressure you were under." Nathaniel looked out toward the river again. People only notice emotional labor once it disappears. Isabella's eyes filled with tears instantly. "You really were drowning this whole time, weren't you?" Nathaniel laughed softly without humor. "I just got good at hiding it." Silence returned again, but this silence felt different. Honest, somehow. Isabella wiped her eyes quickly before speaking again. "After you left the wedding, everything fell apart almost immediately." Nathaniel remained calm. "I figured." Isabella shook her head sadly. "No, you don't understand. The money, problems, the vendors, the guests arguing, Dad finally confronting Mom publicly. It was chaos." Nathaniel lowered his eyes toward the table thoughtfully. "That's what happens when families depend on one person emotionally without appreciating them as a human being." Isabella covered her mouth briefly while tears slipped down her face again. "I should have defended you sooner." Nathaniel finally looked directly at her. "Why didn't you?" Isabella froze at the question. Because deep down, she already knew the answer. "I think," she whispered carefully, "I was scared Mom would turn on me too." Nathaniel stared at her silently for several long seconds before nodding slowly. "That's the problem with controlling people. Everyone around them learns survival before honesty." Isabella broke down crying quietly after hearing that. Not because he was cruel, but because he was right. Nathaniel reached across the table and gently pushed a napkin toward her. Even after everything, kindness still came naturally to him. That realization somehow made Isabella cry harder. "Do you hate us?" she asked shakily. Nathaniel looked genuinely surprised by the question. "No," he answered honestly. "I'm just tired." Those 3 words carried years of emotional exhaustion behind them. Isabella lowered her eyes again, while the weight of guilt settled heavily across her expression. "Mom keeps saying you embarrassed the family." Nathaniel gave a faint, bitter smile. "Families that care more about appearances than feelings usually embarrass themselves eventually." Isabella nodded slowly, because she finally understood that now. Outside the restaurant windows, rain began falling softly across the river, while city lights blurred against the wet glass. Nathaniel watched the storm quietly, before speaking one final truth aloud. "I spent most of my life believing love meant enduring pain without complaint," he said calmly. "But real love shouldn't require someone to slowly destroy themselves just to keep everyone else comfortable." Isabella looked at him through tears, while silence settled gently between them again. This time the silence did not feel cold. It felt like grief finally becoming honest. And honestly, honesty hurt far less than pretending ever did. If this chapter connected with your own experiences, leave a comment sharing the hardest truth you ever realized about family relationships. Nobody warns you that the most painful family betrayals rarely happen through screaming matches or dramatic explosions. Most of the time they happen slowly, quietly, through years of small moments where one person keeps giving love, while everyone else slowly stops noticing the damage being done to them. 1 week after Isabella Monroe's wedding collapsed into public humiliation, Nathaniel Brooks stood alone inside his company's private conference room, staring at the city skyline through walls of glass, while employees worked quietly outside. The storm surrounding the Monroe family had spread far beyond private gossip now. Business partners whispered. Family friends chose sides. Social media discussions painted Nathaniel as either the victim or the villain depending on who told the story first. But none of that mattered to him anymore. What haunted Nathaniel most was not the public embarrassment. It was realizing how long he had mistaken emotional survival for love. For years he convinced himself enduring disrespect proved loyalty. He believed sacrificing his peace made him a good son, a good brother, a dependable man. But eventually even the strongest people reach a point where survival becomes more important than maintaining relationships built entirely around their exhaustion. And honestly, Nathaniel had reached that point long before the wedding disaster finally exposed the truth publicly. Late afternoon sunlight reflected across the conference table as Nathaniel loosened the sleeves of his shirt and reviewed documents he had been ignoring all morning. Numbers, contracts, expansion plans, things that normally kept his mind focused. Yet every few minutes his attention drifted back toward the same painful realization. The Monroe family had never truly expected him to leave. That was why they pushed him so far. People only risk destroying someone when they secretly believe that person will stay, no matter how badly they are treated. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Adrian Keller entered carrying a folder under one arm, before quietly closing the conference room door behind him. Your mother called the office again, Adrian said carefully. Nathaniel didn't look surprised. Did she leave a message? Adrian hesitated briefly. She said the family needs to speak privately, before things get worse publicly. Nathaniel laughed quietly under his breath. Interesting choice of priorities. Adrian sat down slowly across from him. You're not going, are you? Nathaniel leaned back in his chair while staring toward the windows. Do you know what's strange? He asked calmly. Even now, they're still more worried about appearances than the actual damage. Adrian remained silent, because he knew Nathaniel was right. Families trapped in toxic patterns often confuse image management with emotional accountability. Nathaniel rubbed his forehead tiredly before continuing. When I was younger, I honestly believed if I became successful enough, eventually my parents would respect me. Adrian frowned slightly. And now Nathaniel looked down at the untouched paperwork spread across the table. Now I think they only respected what I could do for them. Those words settled heavily into the quiet room. Outside the glass walls, employees moved through the office, carrying laptops and coffee cups, completely unaware of the emotional collapse happening behind closed doors. Nathaniel suddenly remembered something Isabella told him during their conversation at the restaurant days earlier. Mom was always hardest on you, because she expected you to survive it. At the time, those words felt painful. Now they simply felt true. People often place impossible emotional pressure on the strongest person in the family because strength creates the illusion that damage does not exist. But strength is not the absence of pain. It is simply pain carried silently for too long. Nathaniel's phone vibrated softly across the table again. Another message from Catherine Monroe. You're humiliating this family by refusing to speak to us. Nathaniel stared at the screen for several long seconds before locking the phone again, without responding. Adrian watched him carefully. Does it bother you? Nathaniel gave a faint, bitter smile. The sad part is she still thinks silence is about punishment. He looked back toward the city skyline. It's not punishment anymore. It's protection. Adrian nodded slowly because that distinction mattered. Emotionally exhausted people eventually stop explaining themselves, not because they hate others, but because survival finally teaches them that constant self-defense becomes another form of self-destruction. The office remained quiet for several moments before Adrian spoke again. Edward contacted me too. Nathaniel's expression tightened slightly. What did he want? Adrian exhaled slowly. Honestly, I think he's starting to realize how badly they failed you. Nathaniel looked away immediately after hearing that. Because deep down that truth hurt more than the cruelty itself. Parents are supposed to protect their children emotionally, not stand silently beside the people hurting them. Nathaniel spent years forgiving Edward's silence because confrontation made his father uncomfortable. But silence can wound people too. Sometimes permanently. Rain clouds slowly gathered outside the glass windows while darkness began settling across the city. Nathaniel stood up and walked toward the skyline quietly. "You know what finally broke me?" he asked without turning around. Adrian stayed seated. Nathaniel folded his arms tightly across his chest, realizing, "I was more useful to my family than I was loved by them." The room fell completely silent after those words, because some truths sound unbearable precisely because they are honest. Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the city lights. He still loved his family. That was the tragedy of it all. Love did not disappear overnight simply because people caused pain. But love alone could no longer justify destroying himself emotionally, just to keep everyone else comfortable. And for the first time in his life, Nathaniel was finally beginning to understand that protecting his peace did not make him cruel. It made him human. Sometimes the most heartbreaking endings are not the ones filled with hatred, screaming, or revenge. Sometimes the saddest endings happen when someone finally becomes too emotionally exhausted to keep begging for the love they should have received naturally from the very beginning. 2 weeks after Isabella Monroe's wedding disaster shattered the carefully protected image of the Monroe family, Nathaniel Brooks stood alone on the rooftop terrace of his penthouse apartment, while the city lights stretched endlessly beneath the night sky. Cold wind moved through the darkness, as distant traffic echoed below. But for the first time in years, Nathaniel's mind felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful yet, but quieter. The constant pressure to fix everyone else's emotional chaos had finally stopped following him every second of the day. Catherine Monroe continued leaving angry voicemails demanding family meetings. Edward sent multiple apology messages that Nathaniel still had not answered. Isabella checked on him often, trying to rebuild the relationship. She now realized she should have protected long ago. But Nathaniel no longer felt responsible for managing everyone else's guilt. That burden had nearly destroyed him already. The terrifying thing about emotional exhaustion is that by the time people finally notice it, the person suffering has usually been drowning silently for years. And honestly, Nathaniel was done drowning for people who only loved him when he was useful. The rooftop air felt cold against his skin as he leaned against the railing overlooking the glowing city skyline. He remembered being younger and believing family loyalty meant enduring pain without limits. No matter how unfairly someone treated you, you stayed. You forgave. You sacrificed. That was the message deeply rooted inside him for most of his life. But experience eventually taught him a brutal truth. Loyalty without respect slowly becomes emotional imprisonment. And love without safety eventually turns into survival instead of connection. Behind him, the rooftop door opened softly. Nathaniel didn't need to turn around to recognize the footsteps approaching. Adrian Keller walked toward him carrying 2 glasses of whiskey, before handing one over quietly. "You ignored another 20 calls today," Adrian said with a faint smirk. Nathaniel accepted the drink calmly. "I'm improving." Adrian laughed softly before leaning beside him against the railing. For several moments, both men simply stared out across the city lights, without speaking. Some silences heal more than conversations ever can. Finally, Adrian glanced sideways at him. "Do you regret leaving?" Nathaniel answered immediately. "No." The honesty in his voice sounded almost surprising even to himself. Adrian nodded slowly. "Then why do you still look sad?" Nathaniel stared into the glass thoughtfully before answering. "Because losing toxic relationships still feels like loss when you genuinely loved the people involved." That sentence settled heavily into the cold night air. Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly, while memories continued surfacing one after another. Catherine criticizing every decision he made unless it benefited her directly. Edward choosing silence because confrontation made him uncomfortable. Family gatherings where Nathaniel felt more like a financial safety net than a son. Isabella standing quietly beside him for years, without realizing how badly he was breaking inside. None of those memories disappeared, simply because the truth had finally come out publicly. Healing doesn't erase pain instantly. It simply teaches people they deserve better than the pain they normalized. Nathaniel's phone suddenly vibrated inside his jacket pocket again. Another message from Edward. "I should have protected you." Nathaniel stared at the screen for several long seconds before slowly locking the phone again. Adrian watched carefully beside him. Still not ready, Nathaniel exhaled quietly. I spent years begging people to understand how much they hurt me. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Now I need time to understand why I accepted it for so long. Adrian nodded, because that realization mattered deeply. Emotionally neglected people often become experts at minimizing their own pain just to preserve relationships around them. Nathaniel had spent most of his life convincing himself he was strong enough to tolerate emotional disrespect. But strength is not measured by how much suffering someone can survive silently. Real strength is recognizing when survival is no longer healthy. Wind swept across the rooftop again while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the skyline. Nathaniel lifted his eyes toward the city below and spoke quietly into the darkness. You know what scares me most? Adrian frowned slightly. What? Nathaniel tightened his grip around the whiskey glass. Part of me still wants them to become the family I needed. Adrian remained silent because some truths do not need immediate answers. Hope is difficult to kill, especially when it involves the people someone spent their entire life trying to love properly. Nathaniel laughed softly under his breath after a few seconds. That's probably the saddest part of all this. Adrian looked at him carefully. What is? Nathaniel stared out across the endless city lights, while his voice lowered almost to a whisper. Even after everything, I still wanted them to choose me over their pride. The silence afterward felt painfully honest. Somewhere below the rooftop, the city continued moving normally, while Nathaniel stood between grief and healing at the exact same time. Because recovery from emotional damage is not dramatic the way movies portray it. Sometimes it simply looks like finally learning you deserve peace too. Nathaniel took one final slow breath before looking toward the skyline again. For the first time in years, he was no longer trying to save his family from themselves. And honestly, that freedom felt both heartbreaking and beautiful at the exact same time.